Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 523rd episode of Constructed Criticism. I'm your host, Mason Jordan, my co-host, Abe Stein. Abe, how you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. Unfortunately, there's no video for this podcast, but I'll have you know, Mason, I did get a fresh cut for the viewers. I really cleaned up today, and I'm sad that I don't get to share it with the world, but we'll have to wait for next week for that.
It would really balance it out. Part of working from home and today's like today means that I just stayed in my pajamas all day. Like, I'm ready to go to bed after this.
I hate you for that. Can I say that? Is that fair?
Yeah, you're allowed to say it. Now, the fair part, that's different, but you are allowed to say it. But let's get into things when it comes to this week's main topic. We're doing an episode about staying sharp in Magic and sort of the idea of avoiding rust and sort of staying on top of things. And Abe, you were talking about this one thing before we started the podcast. I'd love to kick it to you and then have our conversation grow from there. Talk to me about sort of seeing the forest through the trees.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about staying sharp in Magic, and it's something that I think, like life happens to a lot of us. Things will come up. You're not able to play for a while. I think there's a large misconception, even when I don't know, like was playing all the time in college, that I was like playing literally all the time. I mean, even over like pandemic, when I was playing a lot online, I would still take month-long, 3-month-long breaks when I just wasn't having fun with it, was burnt out, not enjoying things. And I would come back, and it wouldn't take long, and I'd roughly be around where I started and picking up new things. And a lot of my success in that comes from, what you just referenced, which is like kind of my ability to not miss the forest for the trees. People often say that expression of, you're missing the forest for the trees, like you're focusing on the small stuff rather than, appreciating the big picture. And I think that, above all, as we talk about the rest of this, the big thing about staying sharp for me has always come from trying to take the time to understand what's happening in the games of Magic I'm playing, and just in like what's important in formats or what's important in games these days, in a lens of like, what are the exchanges that are important, really bring them down to their most basic parts and then evaluating them at a high level. Because that way, when I have to hop back in, I mean, for example, like right now is a perfect example. I'm going to have to start prepping for Modern RCQ season as well as the Pioneer RC. That's actually my big project this month is Pioneer RC, and also a little bit of dabbling in Modern is my kind of off thing.
Behind the scenes, I messaged you earlier today saying, "Are you preparing for DC?" And you didn't reply, and I was like, "Guess he's not preparing." Now I know. All right, now we know.
I am. I responded to that and asked you about the cards in your deck.
You responded to my deck, but you didn't tell me, and I thought maybe it was just a homie move. Like, yeah, I'm not preparing, but I love Mason. I'll give him the reply. Now I know.
I am preparing. Right. I am. Let the world know right. I'm preparing. But as I'm hopping into that, there are things that I'm sure will be rusty and will take a bit of time for me to really grok. I'll make some mistakes. But when I come back to it and I'm thinking about the matchups I'm facing, even though all the cards might be different, or the format drastically different now than when I really put in a lot of time to Pioneer last, right before Pro Tour Murders, all of that, I will have what I feel is a pretty sizable advantage over most people who would be in my position of knowing what matters and knowing what I need to do in those games, because I've taken the time, and I've always taken the time to try to understand what's going on at the high level and then start figuring out the details from there. Because if you're doing it the inverse, which I think a lot of players do, and most players who ask me, I haven't played in, so long, is this, that, or the other still good? Or, like what's important now? And it's like, well, decks are for now, but formats last a lot longer, and especially like non-rotating formats. And so if you really understand what's happening and what makes a deck strong or a deck weak or a format, work or not work, I think that's really the number one thing you can do to stay sharp. Like if you're just gonna listen to the first 6 minutes of this episode and then turn it off saying you got everything you got, that's what I would say, is make sure that you're thinking about the big picture, because ultimately when it comes to shaking off the rust and being effective right out the gate, or getting in there and being in the trenches roughly just about as clean as you were before. I'm not going to say I'm John Finkel levels of put down Magic, pick it up, a year and a half later and suddenly be winning. But if you want to get close to there or start seeing improvements, it really comes from the macro.
Yeah, and I think this is something that like we often probably talk about with other people and realize not even realize we're doing it. Where like when you're having discussions about getting into the format, so often really it's talking to other players about what they think is going on, right? And you're trying to like everyone's kind of working on like the bigger picture stuff, and then like they get into the nitty gritty kind of once they're caught up. And the act of catching up can sometimes be the hardest part, right? And a lot of players feel like they need to like, oh, I need to play, 50, 60 matches or whatever. And I think being able to kind of identify these things you're talking about, Abe, and then act on them really speeds up the process. And the only way to really get to a place where you can do that like in the future is to invest a lot of time now, sort of starting to get the work in. It's a lot like going to the gym in my mind, where it's kind of like it's going to suck at first. You might not even see some gains, but as time goes on, you'll notice, even if you're not there for like, a week or two, you're just going to feel better. You're going to have, higher energy, that kind of stuff. And so I think when we talk about like staying sharp and seeing the forest through the trees, a lot of it to me, and I think, correct me if you disagree here, is about kind of getting that baseline understanding of like, how do I identify what's going on in the format? How do I, it's like figure out how to build a sideboard and have sideboard plans? How do I decide what matters in these matchups? How do I go about practicing with that in mind, right? And sort of building up a bunch of fundamental skills now so that when you come back, you're starting from a much higher starting point, a much, like a higher peak in the valley.
Yeah, I mean, I think something you said in there, which really sticks for me, is just the idea of process. I think it's something we talk about a lot on the show, and for good reason. The number one way to make sure that you are going to be consistent is to have a process around what it is you do, and improving that process and refining that process. That is what yields best results over time. And especially if you're, having to take a break, or, feeling like you just need to take a step back, or the RCQ season isn't the format you want to play, or, whatever it is that happens. If you know how it is that you prepare well, and you don't have to worry about, am I gonna have to remember like all of like how it is I play my deck, or what my like the mechanics of all of my game actions, or what are the other decks in the format again? What do they do? If understanding all of that is something that you have a process for, either taking in the new information of the new decks and understanding them and learning about them for the things that have changed since you last touched the format, or understanding how new releases have impacted things. If you have a process for intaking that information and working with it, you're gonna be able to be sharp rather than having to reinvent the wheel every time that you come back to a format. I know that I'm sure that you've experienced this, Mason, between coaching and between even just being in your local scene. But there are a lot of players who I've known for years who will play for a year or two and then be out for a year or two and then get back in for a year or two. And for some of them who at times, were really good. I'm talking like, I have this experience actually talking to Dylan Jealous, who I know you know.
Mm-hmm.
Multiple time Grand Prix top 8 competitor in limited. Amazing limited player. But he's a player who really understands formats. He really works draft format to draft format. And it's astonishing drafting with him locally, because he lives pretty close to me, that he doesn't really necessarily keep it format to format and kind of has to grind it into place every time, because his evaluation, much to his credit and his success, is really based in the micro of like what's going on in a format, what are the good cards, what are the good exchanges, what really matters, and remembering and intuiting that, versus kind of a player like me, or I think probably the best example would be like Sam Black, who plays from a very theoretical perspective of like, well, these cards should be good, like they look really strong, or this game plan looks like it should work, and I'm sure I can make this happen because I can envision the big picture. And I don't do that on the same scale as Sam, but it's kind of how I approach new formats. And the way that Dylan approaches new formats is the same way, except he's a little bit worse at it than me. So, like, at the start of the format, when we're drafting it together, he'll often do worse in our team drafts and everything, but then he slowly builds up because he's getting it, he's understanding it in ways that often wind up surpassing me even if I'm playing sometimes at the same level, and I learn a lot from it. So I think it's important to just remember, as we're talking about staying sharp, that process, right? That's what really takes his game and took him to multiple GP top 8s and multiple great successes playing limited, is being able to do that work to go from zero to a mastery of the format. But where he's struggled historically has been constructed where that's a lot harder. And switching between, modern decks or between Pioneer decks or even between the modern format and the Pioneer format season over season was not really his strong suit because he didn't have a good process for grasping a bigger picture like that format. And I think that, as a player at any level, having a process in place to either, be it that you're checking the MTG Goldfish, page for deck lists that are done, checking all the daily events, the prelims, all the challenges to see what the deck lists are and what's being played, or reading, articles, or watching videos, or listening to podcasts like this. All of that is part of a process that really helps you stay sharp even when you're not playing.
Yep, I totally agree. And I think, one of the episodes you can look in the past to when it comes to this is sort of, one is rules of engagement, understanding that concept, I think, and not even, the act of just being able to sort of define those things when you come back and be like, okay, what is this? I think that is very helpful. And I think we talked about macro game planning on one episode, and I think that one as well will be helpful. So hopefully we'll have those linked, but if not, you can Google, Constructor in those words, and you should be able to find the episodes. They're like in the last 50-ish, I think. But yeah, I think those are such huge and valuable things. And I feel like so many players are kind of like your friend there, Abe, where like when they pick up a format, they really struggle when like switching between them because, one, sometimes the incentives are just way off. I was talking to someone in coaching the other day, and they were talking about how they felt like they were playing Control and Pioneer so much worse than in Modern. Because in Modern, they had like this, almost everything I can't let stick around. I've got to point and click, right? The cards are so much stronger. Mm-hmm. And in Pioneer, they were pointing and clicking on cards that they probably could have let stay on the board for a couple turns and cleaned up with a Wrath. They could have maybe used that turn to deduce and, make their land drops and do that sort of thing. Cast a Memory Deluge instead of cast the Wandering Emperor and minus right away. You can just take your time, sort of sculpt your game plan. And I think that is, a really important part of it too, is to sort of like pay attention to the kind of format you're playing, right? And I think Limited actually teaches you this really well, but there's more of like at the beginning of the format, you kind of, I should say, as you learn the format, you learn like, is this a fast format or is this a grindy format? Like a good example that would be All We Won. There were decks that people played that were slower, more monotonous decks, but they were very rare. They were kind of like, you had to have the right rares, have the right situation pop up to make those happen. So going into playing that format, hey, this is sort of what it's going to be like, right? Where, in a format like Bloomburrow is, similar-ish, where it's kind of like, okay, you're going to be kind of curving out using more normal limited stuff in comparison to something maybe even like All Will Be One. I'm sorry, not All Will Be One, excuse me. March of the Machines, where that one had a lot more going on. And then, you could play longer games. And if you're just going into the limited format, taking everything, you learn from All Be One, but not checking it at the door when you start playing March of the Machines, you're going to be in for a rude awakening. Your Grizzly Bear is not going to go nearly as far when people are playing, a lot of these special guest mythic rare bombs. You kind of have to understand what's going on, right? And so I think having that sort of check-in, I think, is one of the important things about staying sharp and staying on top of this, is sort of acknowledging the type of Magic you are playing. Because at the end of the day, Magic is just a bunch of different game pieces, and then we play different games that are using the same pieces, right? And this is why some players like some formats and don't like others, is because they don't like some games, They like high power wombo combo kill you games with vintage, and other players don't, you know? So that I think is a big part of the whole process as well.
Yeah, most definitely. And I mean, I think it also goes beyond just having a process. I mean, I know we've talked about this in like the lateral thinking episodes, part 1 and part 2, but there's a lot of other things that we do, especially when time is being occupied by things that aren't Magic, or we just decide we want to break from Magic, like what we're taking time to do that, like take that break for. I don't know about you, Mason, but I have I was going to say a real flaw, but I don't think it's a flaw. I have a personality trait to myself, which is that I have a really hard time just doing something casually. Like just not really caring about how I do with it, not trying to push myself to, do it as efficiently or best as I can, not trying to like really engage with it and understand it. Like most things I pick it up I was raised, if I'm going to do it, I might as well try to do it right or do it well. And I don't know, like I find that that's really helped me in terms of staying sharp, because building those processes for or trying to understand the flow of other similar games to Magic. Like in the past, I've learned a lot from playing Hearthstone. Like actually, a lot of what I learned about like mana efficiency and deploying my resources effectively and steadily, especially playing aggro decks, came from playing Hearthstone for like 2 years on and off. That I feel like that's a skill that I really was able to leverage in playing like Modern Affinity for a long time, just managing all those resources and getting everything I could out of what I had. Or, like playing even like Eternal TCG, I learned a lot from playing that. Or, even like disc golf, I learned a lot about how I learn things and from the ground up. And bringing that back when I come back to Magic, that is another way that I also find that I'm able to stay sharp and keep improving, or at least keep coming at Magic with a fresh mind, so that I don't find myself falling into a rut of spinning my wheels, or don't come back to it just feeling completely shell shocked because I'm like, oh, this. Okay, so I'm coming back because now it's new RCQ season. I haven't played in 2 or 3 months. Oh, what is this deck doing? Or like, oh, how do I want to do this differently this month? And keeps things fresh for me. I don't know if you have that same experience of having other things you do that kind of fire the same neurons in your brain as Magic does to kind of work that out and flex that muscle of your brain. I find that there's a lot that I find in the things I do that I can then come bring back with me, and it just makes it makes the process that much more exciting.
Yeah, no, for sure. I definitely feel that same way. And I think like one of the things I think about life is that learning is fun, but schools and like sort of media teach you it isn't fun, because you're often put in situations where you don't care that much about something. And often you have to care a little bit or be open to it. And, as kids slash like, it's put into you pretty early, like, oh, school isn't fun or whatever. But I think learning is really fun, and then it's really cool to kind of apply those things in other directions. We hear all the time in Magic how players are like, "Oh, I learned this thing in Magic, and it helped me in real life." Like a big one that I hear from a lot of people is like dealing with variance. It's like, "Oh, my tire went flat this week." Yeah, it happens. And for other people, that might ruin their whole day. You know, but it's just like, well, these things happen. Like I've, haven't had any other bad things happen. Blah blah. It occurs. We move on. And I think like I do have other habits and other things that end up helping me in Magic and other areas of my life. And I'm trying to kind of be that, eternal student and always be willing to learn. I think, when it comes to other games, an example is Marvel Snap, where that game really helps with like sequencing, and at least in my opinion, of like, okay, I kind of play all my cards at once and then I flip against my opponents, and not only what order I want to play my cards in where, but also if my opponent does something, how would I want this to kind of play out exactly? And I think that's helpful for me in Magic, because I think, sequencing is a big part of the game. I talk about it a lot. But also when it comes to like cooking, where it's like, okay, like I know I want to make this for dinner. What's like the most efficient way to make this meal that I want to make? Or cook this thing I want to cook. And I think like in the same lines, cooking and doing things in that way, like, is really helpful when it comes to Magic. Like kind of having that process and knowing what you want, and sometimes even like being like, oh, if I did something like this, how would that change this outcome very similar to magic and kind of gets me thinking in very similar ways. And so I think there's just a lot of times where I'm trying to take things from my normal life and just, apply magic theory to them, or, have them later apply to magic. When it comes to like, going to the gym or whatever, I think I haven't had like crazy results or whatever, despite going fairly consistently, because I know I haven't been pushing myself as hard because I've been trying to like make sure that like going to the gym is like a thing I want to do and it's part of a habit and a routine. And like now I'm starting to like cut out all sodas and like sweet drinks from my thing and like make a habit of like having a better diet. And I'm trying to put myself in a position where this is just second nature and normal and I'm not diving in all the way head first. And I did the same thing when it came to magic. I really took like how I learned magic and got to where I am now, and I'm applying that same pattern and process to getting healthy, where I'm starting to like research more things about being like, now that I kind of feel like I have this basic stuff down, I'm starting to watch different things. I'm like, okay, like what's really the nitty gritty in this, and going to apply that, to myself the same way I do with magic, where it's like, well, I shouldn't be worrying too much about like this high level crazy, like, the read plays or Jedi mind tricks or something like that, because I can't attack and block. Like, what am I doing? And it's not a part of my like habit in my life. So I definitely feel like that is something I do. I try to apply things, and then they help me in other areas. And I think this is what the lateral thinking episodes are about, and why they are ones that we've done one, two of, and two are such like kind of timeless episodes. And I think it's just important for players to like, and listeners, I guess I should really say, understand that at the end of the day, you really only need to do what you want to do when it comes to magic, and there are no wrong answers. And like, this is something that we do to help ourselves, like when we take breaks and come back. But maybe like you don't want to be as serious about it, so you don't need to be as serious. And if the like high level thinking about stuff that's like super cool is more interesting to you, and you can attack and block, that's fine. Go engage with that stuff, but just understand like it probably isn't as helpful until you get those basics down. But if that's more fun to you, well then like what's the point of the game if not that? So I don't know. A little bit of a sidetrack there, but still.
I gotta say, and I never thought of it this way, but yeah, if you can cook a meal from a recipe you find on the internet, you have no excuse for not thinking your turn all the way through before you take it. I like every time I cook a meal, I feel like for myself, I'm like, I need to do all these things, and I need to lay them all out and make sure I sequence them well. And I've never once drawn that parallel for myself because I've never thought to. But like, yeah, if you're like, and I think that's a great example too, right? Like, there are so many things you can do and so many parallels you can draw between the things you do, and even if it just frames it in a way that helps you improve it when you come back to Magic, right? If you're taking a break and then you're right, and you're coming back, okay, well, how am I going to get better? Well, Coach Mason says, make sure you think through all the actions in your turn before you do them, and then do them. It's like, well, that seems like so much work. I can't do this. But you had date night and you went and made shrimp scampi for two from a recipe online, and you went and shopped for it and did it right. You went and got everything, and then you did this. Like, you can plan through a whole turn, or even, plan out all of your sideboard guides for a sideboard guide for all the matchups you think you're going to play at the RCQ, right? You can do it, and you can learn the skill, and doing all these other things in life, it all, following processes to do other things in life helps you in Magic, a game that is, just about entirely about using your brain. And I think that, I don't know how much more there is to say about it other than, what does it take to stay sharp? Make sure you're staying mentally sharp and ready to engage and, ultimately, as goal of this show, compete, but really just to give it your all and be engaged when you do come back to Magic. I don't know if you have anything else you want to say before we wrap up here, Mason.
No, I wanted to give another small example that maybe will help get the idea across if someone's having a hard time. And if not, thanks for listening to the episode. We're going to do Always Improving in the segment. It's always good to have you. But I was just, one thing that comes up a lot for people in coaching that they struggle with is this idea of thinking about what your opponent's incentives are and what they're going to do on the turn. I had this actually come up today in a great spot in coaching where the long story short is they're kind of in a stalled-ish Borosy mirror, but the opponent has one flying creature off a Guide of Souls. and they have more life total. So they're kind of pecking away at, the coaching person, and are watching this replay, and they make this attack with their Amped Raptors. The Amped Raptors are first striking, and the only other first striking creature is like another Amped Raptor and an Ocelot Pride. And part of it was hoping that the opponent would trade Ocelot Pride for the Raptor. But in reality, what happened is the opponent was able to crack back for more because they were afforded that life total differential, right? And we started talking a little bit about kind of thinking about what your opponent is going to go through and kind of like what their incentives are and what they're thinking about. And I think when applying to the real life stuff to this, you've probably had a conversation with someone that you knew was going to be kind of tough, and you have to think about things from their perspective and in their shoes, right? Like, if you're listening to this podcasting at a time where you're like, I got to come to somebody and I know this is a tough conversation, but we got to figure out some way to meet in the middle and figure things out. That same like brain pattern and thinking process is how you like figure this stuff out, where it's like, okay, is my opponent really going to trade their very strong creature for my 2/1 when I am, down 9 life to them or whatever? I think they'll probably just, be only up 5 and not lose their very strong card instead. And stuff like that, where that's obviously like a very basic example, but I think that so often players struggle like thinking through the whole turn. A big thing I hear is like, well, I want to do this, and then when they counter this, right, I'll then figure it out. And it's like, well, you can kind of already think about it, right? Like, especially if the options are minimal. If countered, what would you do? If uncountered, what would you do? Right? And very similarly, when you're having a conversation with someone, it's like, maybe we need to fix what's going on in this partnership, right? If no, then this is kind of probably what happens. And if yes, we're going to kind of do something like this. And so I think taking these ways that you think and approach is so important and can be done in Magic, very similar to the other thing. And just know that now the work you're putting in today is going to pay off later. There at some point where you will take a break, whether it's 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years. If you decide to come back and play, the work you put in today will help you long term. And both, your actual competitive Magic, but also kind of like being able to come back and sort of turn 0 into 1 and get up to speed. So I would just highly suggest really trying to immerse yourself with like things that help you long term, and sort of the idea of like more healthy foods versus snack foods, right? It can be really tempting to just, get the sideboard guide from somebody else and then go and play. But it can be really helpful to spend that time working on your own sideboard guide and then reflecting on it and then looking at the other person's and then going and playing, even though you don't get that instant satisfaction that you do from getting in and playing.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better myself. I think there's actually a quote that I think about a lot from Alexander Hayne, somewhere on the Table for Two podcast. Magic is a game about using your brain and not letting it turn itself off. And the number one thing people hate to do is actively think. Like, your brain consciously, like, constantly is fighting against you trying to actively engage it to think about a problem or a solution or whatever it is and really use it to its full potential, because it doesn't like to exert. Your brain does not like to do that. And I think that, the key to staying sharp is to just put yourself in more of those positions in any aspect of your life. Use your brain, engage it and let it be active. And when you come back to Magic, fire up those same synapses and get to work, because anything that keeps your brain moving and keeps you thinking actively about something, if you are able to engage with Magic when you have the time to do that, when you come back from whatever break it is you take, you will notice that you are able to see the gains or see the returns or get back to where you were faster than you did before, because you're used to it. Like people say, it's, you can do like board state puzzles, or make sure you still play like a draft or two every now and then. It's like, why does that work? Because it keeps you thinking in the same patterns and using those same reasoning muscles in your brain to really solve for things, and that does help you grow and help you stay sharp and keep yourself from falling into a state of being rusty and not really knowing what's going on. So yeah, I just think about that a lot. I think it's a good thing to chew on as you go out of this episode as a listener.
Thank you all so much for listening to that. If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/ccmtg. And you can join Mikey, Joshua, McFish, and Andrew, who all joined the Patreon this week. Thank you all so much for your support. The show will always be free, but if you want to give back some, it's greatly appreciated. We have the Discord community where there's a lot of conversation happening. We got some talks about Pioneer and sort of various decks right now. I see some players, discussing kind of like habits that they form and things like that. It's very interesting and very much improving, and also some fun times happen there. So if that sounds like something that interests you, maybe check out patreon.com/ccmtg and see if that's what you want to do. Now it's time for the main point of the show, which is always improving. Always improving is sort of, something that we really take into account in the show, and we want to spend every week talking about how we improved at Magic or something in life in general over the last week, or tried to take some lesson and put it to heart. Abe, what was your always improving moment from this last week?
My always improving moment this week actually came from the Arena Open, where I actually didn't realize there was an Arena Open happening over the weekend. Fun fact. And I, once again, just like I did last time, went to fire just the one bullet. I wanted to play it really seriously. And I had a moment where I was back against the wall, down. I was playing traditional sealed. It was my third match. I was down a game, and I was very badly losing the second. Like, I'd just gotten caught in a really bad blocking situation by my opponent. The game kind of stalled out, but they were ahead, and so they had their big turn where they were able to get a lot of my best creatures off the board. And I had this instinct of like, okay, like, I'm just dead or whatever. But I just stopped and went, you know what? It's my tournament life on the line. I am losing this game, I'm pretty sure. So why not just play out, what it is I have left? So instead of conceding, I sat there and I thought like, okay, well, what could I do? And I had made the blocks around, what I thought they could have and they did have. So I still had some resources left, and I drew for turn, and it was like the tormenting voice that pumps your creature from the set that gives them a fish. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name. But I was like, well, this actually, and then I actually proceeded to go on to win that game because I drew the perfect 2 cards, which were 2 removal spells for the only 2 creatures that mattered on my opponent's board. And I was able to cast, one of them was the +1/+0 and deal damage into its power for my lifelink creature. And it just like swung the whole thing around. And then, at least for that turn, like I was still behind, but I was in it. I'd solved the immediate problems, and we were kind of top decking. And I had a fountain port, so I was making fish and kind of just like slowly clawing my way back into the game. And that whole feeling of like not giving up and actually choosing to play it out, like, I don't know, when your opponent just casts Rabbit Response after attacking with like 5 more creatures than you have blockers for, it's very, very tempting to just give up the game because you just lost a bunch of your board and you have like next to nothing left, and you're sitting with a planes in your hand and your red-white deck. What are you going to do? But I got really rewarded for that, and I think that just continuing to give the respect that I want to the shots that I do take in online Magic, something I know I've been bad about in the past, and like, kind of a product of just drafting for fun, or doing like a bunch of cube drafts on Magic Online and just really enjoying myself, is not always playing with that edge when I play online, but fighting that urge and instinct to be like, it is hopeless. I think I have no outs, and just continue to play it out in case something did happen. And seeing that happen it was really validating, and it's not something that I would have always done, and is definitely a product of this new mentality that I know I've talked about now for I think twice on the last few weeks of the show. But I think it's just important to talk about, and yeah, I mean, just playing it all the way through the same way I would in paper. And really, I did all of the work to be in that game at all, right? I played around my opponent, not just having their onboard tricks, but also having this Rabbit Response that, made the combat go favorably for them. Understood what my outs even were or what it was I was trying to draw to, and making sure to, if I was putting all the time into making those blocks, why would I just concede? And, for not conceding, I was rewarded with the opportunity to win the game. And, I just think that that's something I want to make sure to enshrine here in this always improving segment, so that I can stick with it every time I play online from here on out.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think that's something that's so easy to just do, especially online, with like when you're playing online, it's so much easier to just be like, well, I lost, time to go, hang out with my girlfriend or get something done around the house or just play again, right? Like there's so much less like at stake where, if this was a Grand Prix, like this probably wouldn't be an always improving moment. Like maybe it would have, but it probably wouldn't have clicked the same way because you like traveled all this way, you spent all this money. Obviously, you're going to do everything you can, right? And maybe it'd be more of a mentality shift of like, instead of giving up, blah, 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 like I hunkered down. But I do think that like, it's interesting how like online Magic, especially Magic Arena, can feel so different that way because the stakes feel so much lower.
Yeah, and I mean, especially with like the Arena Open, like, it was my second match, so if I lost it, I lost my bullet, and I was like, okay, well, if I really wanted to play again, I could have. I have the gems. I could go again.
Yeah.
But, and I didn't even know it was happening. I wasn't that invested in it, but I decided I was going to play, and even though it was kind of on a whim decision that I made in the afternoon, I still said, if I'm going to do this, I want to care. Whereas the last time it was like, oh, I know that this is happening. I have the time. I've blocked it out. I'm going to do this. Even this time, just carrying that mentality over was really good. And I think that, there's a lot of times where the concede button's right there and you don't want to, right? Something bad happens to you a game and you don't want to play it out. Right? You're like, now I have to play from really far behind. This sucks, right? Like, yeah. I wanted to just steamroll on my opponents and win. That was going to be awesome. But battling against that is something that, at a lot of times, especially, I know of a bad habit when I don't particularly care about a tournament of maybe not giving it 110 every turn, but to do that and to get rewarded was pretty special. So, yeah. How about you, Mason? What was your always improvement with?
I was going to say real quick, I think that's great, by the way. I know I gave you, like, I kind of talked about how, like, it's different online or whatever, but I did just want to highlight that I do think it's great, like, always putting your best foot forward. My always improving moment comes from this past weekend. I played in RCQ, and I won! I got my 2 invites, Abe. I'm done for the season. And the big thing about it was more of pulling the trigger on playing Yogg. And that's despite it being kind of a tough deck. And what I mean by a tough deck, I think I've realized recently talking to people, is a little different than I think they do. So I did want to highlight that quickly here, where part of what I think is tough about Yawgmoth is you only have a few cards that are actually good. And this is kind of like a thought I've had about Yawgmoth, and like the way I play my games, it really reflects it. Where I kind of think the card Grist and Yawgmoth, and to some extent Bowmaster, but mostly Grist and Yawgmoth, are the only good cards in my deck. And every other card in my deck is enabling them. Now, I have some all-star enablers. Like Chord of Calling is one of the best enablers for a creature deck ever, right? And Agatha's Soul Cauldron is one of the best like enablers for activate abilities on creatures ever. So I have a strong supporting cast, but at the end of the day, I kind of have only 8 cards that actually win the game and do something. And everyone else is just part of the band to, support them. And I think that's really tough because, like, when I play against those decks, the kind of decks I typically play, it's very easy to, like, hyper focus on that element and sort of push and just not allow them to have it and overwhelm them. And what I've realized sort of leaning into it is that not everyone plays those decks, so I have a little bit of a cognitive bias, right? Because I typically play decks that can hard focus down like a Yogg or a Grist or a Soul Cauldron or, a Birthing Ritual in the case of that deck. And then it's like, okay, from there it's really easy. And I kind of stepped back and was like, no, I think Yogg's really good. I don't think there's actually going to be a ton of those decks. I think this deck actually is very strong in a couple of things. I'm going to pull the trigger, and played a lot of like not great matchups, to be honest, Abe. I think the best matchup I played for myself on the weekend probably was Tron, which is, I don't know, maybe the new versions of Gorios are easier. Now they can't grief scam me. But like, I didn't have like a ton of matchups where I was super excited to be playing them. But I kind of, went in, played the best I could, sort of, thought about my turns, spent a lot of time, put a lot of focus into everything, and just gave it my all and was rewarded. I think I lost one game on the whole weekend, let alone a match. Or not, I should say, not even a single match. And it was just nice to kind of like push aside those thoughts and be not only rewarded, but also willing to take that leap. Even if I had lost, this was going to be my always improving moment. It was written on my phone before I had won. That like I've pulled the trigger on this, come hell or high water, this is what's happening. And I don't know, it's just tough sometimes to feel that way and be able to move through it. So,
yeah, I mean, I obviously the result commends you, but I also commend you for like, you and I've fallen victim to this too, where like you have a perception of a deck because you play it from a certain angle, or you play against it from a certain angle a lot, and then it feels like you start to get afraid of like, oh well, I know how to pick this deck apart, or I know what the important things are, and I typically come prepared for it, and that means that I'm worried that it's not going to do well, or it has an uphill battle that it's fighting. But being willing to take on that uphill battle because you think that either that some of your conception might be wrong, or that it's worth it in the end because of the advantage opportunities that you have, or the matchups that you think are really important are just going to make it worth it, and you're up to the task of fighting uphill a bit, and maneuvering in the way that your deck does. It can be a lot to choose a deck like that you're not, it's not going to give you an easy day, but feeling it's the best thing and doing it anyway, and signing up for that in the same way that I said during the main talk of the episode that people's brains are actively working against them wanting to think about what they're doing. Signing up for a long day of playing a deck that makes it kind of hard on you is the same way. You're telling yourself from the jump that I'm going to challenge myself to turn my brain on and put in the work and get those wins, and you did it. So that's a great always improvement moment.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the thoughts I had, and even though I disagree with this, a lot of people think Four Color was a hard deck to play, and it's like, well, if I'm willing to play that deck in a bunch of tournaments, I should be willing to play Yawgmoth at like a local RCQ. Especially if I think it's like one of the best decks, if not the best deck in Modern, which I do think is the case. Which, we'll move on. I guess here's a fun little shout out if you're in your Modern RCQ season, and this is going to either age incredibly well or incredibly poorly, so I love these sort of things. Abe, I'm of the belief that Red-White Energy, and I guess Mardu as well, is the Murktide of MH3, and as players play more, they will realize the deck is beatable. It is a good deck, it is a solid deck, but it is probably not the actual best deck. In the same way that Murktide was that way for MH2. And I remember very clearly playing Murktide at the SCG Invitational and kind of having like a middling, result in Modern, playing that kind of deck. And I don't know, I'm just not going to get tricked by the energy deck this time. It's going to need to really prove to me that like this Jundi style deck can actually be the best deck in Modern, because it's doing well, but I just don't think it's like actually the best. So
yeah, I think a lot of what it benefits from right now is incumbency advantage. The deck was really, really refined and continuing to improve against Nadu, but now with Nadu out, the deck has already had a lot of work put into it, but it's starting, at a 10-step head start on everyone else in the format, it feels like, because it was the incumbent. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that there's a lot of room for that deck. That deck's still good, but there's a lot of room for that deck to be kind of eaten up a bit before it starts to push back and kind of be whole and like try to compete against the format. Its days at the top are numbered, is my prediction.
Yeah, I think like my, don't tweet at me in like 2 weeks or whatever if it's still winning. It's 2 months for me. Like, give players time, give them like moments and like incentives to do well, and let's see where energy is, when we're getting into the holidays. That is sort of my thoughts on it. But anyways, Yogg's great. Abe, if you're playing an RCQ this weekend, I highly suggest you should play Yogg. It's really easy to play relative to decks like Hammer. So, anyways.
Everything's easy to play relative to decks like Hammer.
That's true, but I'm talking about a Hammer in its heyday. We'll talk more off the cast. But wrapping up here really quickly, make sure to check out our sponsors, Untapped.gg. You can find the link in the description. There's some awesome new limited features. You're going to want to check that out, especially if you're drafting a lot on Arena. And the swag store. We've got some new stuff in there. We try to price everything as low as we possibly can and not be down on money. So if you like if you'd like to have some swag, check out the swag store. Then, last but not least, Abe, is the Patreon question. Once again, if you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/ccmtg. But this week's Patreon question apparently is for me from one that I missed, and it was just Mason answer for superpowers is what was written.
Yes. So that question is if you got to choose a superpower for yourself, what would you choose?
So I don't know exactly how to describe it, but if you ever watched the Jackie Chan animated series, there was a villain who had, I think, the coolest superpower that always stuck with me. And he was like the guy on the moon. And basically, I think the best way to describe this is he could affect the way that like the amount of mass you had. So like your relation to Earth. So basically he could make it like you were very heavy or very light, if that makes sense. And I've always thought being able to affect something or your own like mass in relation to that is really awesome. Because one, it gives you super strength, right? Like if I can make something really light, like let's say, there's a building, but I make it like a feather or whatever and I can move it, then I'm like as strong as Superman. And also if you try to come at me, I can like put so much weight on you that you like get crushed. So I can't really stop there, but I can also like fly via controlling it, right? So I just think that was a really cool one. I had to go like a traditional superpower, kind of like something you would see on like an A-list comic book. I think super speed would be the answer.
Let's go. My answer was I would be the Flash, but I'd just be responsible with it.
Dude, don't get me started.
I would just resist the call of the void to go run back in time.
Yeah, but also just like I would catch people when they would do bad things near me. Like I don't blame the Flash for not stopping everything, but when there's like a guy in front of him and he gets away, it's like, bro, what's going on? Like he's right. Anyone in eyesight of you cannot get away. Don't act like they can. Now, if you're afraid you're gonna run through a lady, that's different. If you're like, oh, I'm gonna hit somebody and rip them in half, that I understand being a little careful about. But if it's like some dude in a cornfield, he's done. He doesn't get away with a smoke bomb. I watched a lot of the Flash show. It was very frustrating. Very frustrating. Anyways, also, I guess whatever. It's the end of the show. My girlfriend, she loves Smallville. It was one of her like favorite shows, so I got her the complete series on Blu-ray for our anniversary, and we started watching some because I have seen I told her like probably 50 episodes or whatever across the course of my life at various points, and I always liked it, And so we were watching some of it, and Clark is just like basically the Flash, like he's super fast or whatever. In that show, he doesn't fly for most of it apparently, but he does run really quick, and it's like the dude turned the corner and Clark's like, "Where'd he go?" I'm like, "Clark, just run." Just check to the left, check to the right. You'll find him. He can't be that far, And so, super speed is very good. Jumper was a thing that I always thought was a cool superpower too. The one where he could.
Those were like if you can envision it, you can jump there.
Exactly. Yeah, I always thought that was super sick, especially as modern day has gotten like backpack streamers. I'm like logging on to Twitch and like jumping over to Tokyo real quick. I think that'd be sick. So.
Oh yeah, I'm just joining someone's mukbang stream and then going over and hanging out at Ludwig's house.
Yeah, exactly. You're popping around. I guess you get figured out pretty quickly. That's the thing too. Would you be worried? Like I would try to keep it on the down low for the most part. Like I'd save someone's life or whatever, and be like,
it's like winning the lottery. If you have a superpower, you can't let anyone know because then it's not because like it's dangerous to you so much as it is like in a comic book way, as much as it is like. No one ever wants to see you the same. The second they know you're super fast and like, can you run to the store for me? I'm like, come on, man. Like,
maybe I want
go do your own.
Go to
no. That's anime superpowers. That's a different question. Anyway,
anyways, if you want to find us, you could follow us on Twitter at ccmtg. You can join the Patreon, like I said earlier, at ccmtg. You can join the public Discord. You can find us on YouTube, Constructive Criticism or CCMTG. And you can find me personally on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. You can find me at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. I wrote about the modern bannings last week for TCG Player. You can check that out. I'm going to be writing about Duskmourn previews next week. So if you're interested in some of that, check it out. Abe, just 2 more episodes until we do our pick 2 for Duskmorn. Get excited. And if you want to reach out for coaching, I do have some spots. I actually plan to make a Twitter post. So the time this episode is up, it should be up as well. Feel free to DM me on Twitter at Mason E. Clark or reach out via email, masonclark@gmail.com. The too long didn't read is I have some spots open, and I know people have been like unsure if I do because I haven't been posting or saying it on the podcast as much. That's more of like a self-conscious thing and kind of being like, I don't want to put this all over the place. I do have some spots open. Reach out if you're interested in that. Abe, where can someone find you?
People can find me over at More Nothings on Twitter. I currently do not have any coaching spots open. I am booked up. But I expect that after the RC, I will have a little bit more availability for helping with whatever it is you need. So if you're not able to get in with Mason's 6 spots, or you want to work with someone who's far more handsome, then you can talk to me.
Awesome.
Hit me up in DMs.
Thank you everyone for listening to this week's episode of Constructed Criticism.